And now let's talk about how to wire up the ignition system on this. Now there's a lot of confusion going around as to how these are set up. Now the first thing to keep in mind is this is just a standard normal points type ignition system like you'd see in many post-war cars. They're just wired up kind of different compared to most. Now to start with, here's a typical dash wiring harness. Now the red wire is from the coil to an ignition switch. Now here's what's really strange about it. Now this, which will represent the terminal box, which is the power source, there's this little wire that goes from the coil to the terminal box, which is powered at all times, which means the coil has power going to it at all times. The ignition switch actually goes between the coil and the distributor. Now the original pop-out type lock cylinder has an armored cable that goes to the distributor and threads into it, and it just has a terminal that this attaches to. Now the reason they did it this way is because the original switch, when it's turned off, connected the points to ground, so both sides of the points were grounded, which means you couldn't just run a bypass wire from the coil to the distributor. It won't run. You'd have to actually disconnect the ignition switch from the distributor to make it run, and that's why they put an armored cable around the wire to keep anyone from doing that. It's entirely for theft prevention. Now, I don't have an original pop-out switch to show you, but various reproductions have been made over the years, and this is one of them, which is missing the armored cable. But the way it works is turn the key on and it pops out, hence the name pop-out switch. Then you push it back in to turn it off. Then the red wire goes to that terminal, and then this would have a big cable on it and the end would thread into the distributor. Now the problem with it set up this way is you can't run any accessories off the ignition switch. If you want to run a fuel pump or something else, you got to use a separate switch to turn it on and off. Now most other cars, the ignition switch will be between the coil and the power source, and the coil will just be hardwired to the distributor. Now, if you don't have an original pop-out switch and you don't want to go through the expense and trouble of finding one that works, but you want the car to run anyway, there's some modern replacement parts you can get. Like this is what I bought. It's a replacement cable. I think this was about 15 bucks. This is the end that threads into the distributor. And from the outside it's pretty much identical to the original cable, only it only goes long enough to get through the firewall. Then it's just got a loose wire and you can wire it up however you like. For example, that's how it attaches. Then this goes through the terminal box. And then most parts houses will sell some kind of aftermarket ignition switch, like this one. It's just a conventional off-on switch that uses a key, and this will attach to the instrument panel. And then just for a stock application, you can attach the red wire to one terminal and attach this to the other terminal, and then it's wired up just like a stock Model A and will work. So you can wire your car any way you want, but this is how it was done originally. The other confusing thing about these cars is they were originally wired positive ground, which means the ground cable goes to the positive terminal of the battery and the starter cable goes to the negative terminal. And what that means is the electricity travels backwards from the way it would on a negative ground car. Now because of that, the ignition coil needs to be hooked up opposite it would be on a negative ground car. In other words, the minus terminal needs to go to the power source and the plus terminal goes to the distributor. Which, again, can get confusing because the ignition switch is in a different location from where it is on later cars. But just remember, the plus side needs to end up to the positive side of the battery terminal, which, because it's positive ground, it would go to ground, which is the distributor, and the minus side needs to end up at the minus side of the battery. Now, in case you're wondering, you can't hook up the battery either way. It has to be wired up the way the charging system is made for. If the battery's hooked up opposite from what the generator is, the generator will discharge the battery and will probably burn out after a while, as we learned with the Falcon. And most, if not all, alternators have a diode between the negative and positive terminals. So if you hook up the battery backwards on those, that can run the battery down without even starting the engine. So it's all interesting things to keep in mind. Now we'll put this thing together for good. Now I got a clamp that holds the cable to the cylinder head, and the grommet for the terminal box. And I'll try and throw it on. Alright, got it all wired up. Now, there's two terminals here. One has the yellow wires, the other wires are yellow with a black tracer. Now the wire that goes to the coil, I ran it to the one that has the yellow wires, because the wiring diagram I was looking at showed it to be wired that way. Now some people really get bent out of shape over which terminal you attach it to, but it'll work either way. So this is the ignition switch it had in it before. I was going to put that back in, but just for fun I decided to use the pop-out switch that I had, a reproduction that I showed you. So that's all installed. And the wire coming out of it, I attached a connector to it. And now this is ready to go back in. Now here's the wire that comes out of that cable. I fed that under the dash, and it's way longer than it needs to be, which is kind of surprising. I thought it'd be too short. Anyway, it'll work. I put a connector on that, so it'll hook up to the switch, and now we'll put it all back together. Okay, so it won't start. Now, I've spent several hours checking various things, and when I open the points manually, it does throw a spark, so electrically, it's all good. It's some kind of mechanical problem. Now, what I've discovered is, first time I looked at this, I discovered the points were closed. There was no gap at all, they weren't opening, which I thought was pretty strange, but I opened them up, tried to start it again, and it still wouldn't start. So I checked the points again, and then they were too far open. They weren't closing. What I discovered was this plate, which is the one I put in it, was loose in the housing. You could actually wiggle this front and back, and when this thing moves, the point gap changes. So I think that's what the problem was. So now I have the old plate that was on it when I got it, which is a lot tighter. Can't move this one around, so hopefully this will fix it. I'll try it again. And before anyone starts complaining about how bad reproduction parts are, this thing was working in the old distributor. Why, I don't know, but it was. Well, looks like that fixed it. It runs great now, and there hasn't been any other problems with it. So, I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Well, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.